afternoon, everybody. Miles Nagopoline, in his column Crushkin Lawn, claimed there was no such thing as a true Dubliner, that we were all blow-ins by one sort or another, and that really it was a very shallow kind of culture. I'm proud to say that on my mother's side, I'm 6 generations a Dubliner, and I really did enjoy last Sunday. I've been asked to speak on Ireland's global role in peacemaking. I suspect that if you were to take a vox pop outside the building today and ask people, Ireland's role in peacemaking, what is it about? Perhaps the first thing they would say is Irish troops on peacekeeping duty. They have a fine record, having served in the Lebanon, Chad and East Timor and so on. People would refer to the Belfast Agreement, and they'd say, you know, we solved our own intractable problem on this island, and maybe we can help others to do the same. Others might mention the excellent work of the Centre Reconciliation in Glencree and Corrymeela, and point out the great work they have done bringing warring factions together in Cambodia, in East Timor and Cambodia. They might even know about the Conflict Resolution Unit in the Department of Foreign Affairs, set up 5 years ago when the government of the day reviewed our development policy. And Dame Nuala Olone, who's done excellent work, particularly in East Timor, with that particular unit. All of this is noteworthy and praiseworthy. And for a small country like ours, it amounts to quite a contribution. However, the title given to me sets quite a high target: Ireland's global role for a country of 4.5 million people stuck for cash at the moment. And it refers to peacemaking, not peacekeeping, which is one thing, or peace enforcing, which is another. I suspect peacemaking is something else again. From Trócair's perspective as a development agency working in the pursuit of justice, we see this in a very clear and distinct way. In 1967, Pope Paul VI wrote his great encyclical, The Progress of Peoples, and he summed this issue up in one succinct phrase. Development, he said, is the new name for peace. And he went on to elaborate. Peace is not simply the absence of war, based on a precarious balance of power. It is fashioned by efforts directed day after day towards the establishment of a more perfect form of justice. Peace, justice, development, all three are interlinked, all dependent on each other to thrive. And as is often the case with truly prophetic statements, such as the progress of peoples, time has borne out the wisdom of the insight offered by Pope Paul. A study carried out by Paul Collier, who is Professor of Economics in Oxford University and Director of the Centre for African Economics, called The Bottom Billion, looking at the fate of the world's poorest people, 1 in 7 represent the bottom billion, shows that 73% of those people have recently been through a civil war or are still in one. His study went on to point out other alarming facts about poverty and war, many of them counterintuitive. While we might assume that amongst the main causes of civil war would be social injustice, inequality, ethnic division, in fact, the study proves this is not the case at all. To take the example of Somalia. Somalia is Africa's most homogeneous country, ethnically speaking, and is now completing its 20th year of civil war. His study shows that even where social grievance and human rights abuses and oppression are prevalent, they do not necessarily lead to armed rebellion. And when they do, the cause is often quickly diluted as others join the fray. Those who are less motivated are simply opportunistic or even sadistic. Grievance, he says, quickly turns to greed. Really disadvantaged people are usually in no position to rebel. They suffer quietly. And the other prospect is that when it happens, things rarely turn out for the better. My own experience in Ethiopia in the 80s, where there were two civil wars being pursued, one by the Tigrayan People's Army and the other by the Eritreans, is a case in point. To focus on the Eritrea issue, it was a war fought for 30 years, funded by the diaspora, particularly in Canada and the United States. The Eritrean Relief Association was Trócaira's partner in bringing assistance to refugees and others who were impacted by that war. The Mengistu government in Ethiopia used famine as a weapon of war. The EPLF, the army side, were seen as an inspirational group of patriotic young people fighting for justice. In 1992, they achieved independence. Today, Eritrea is a dictatorship. The president has locked up his cabinet. He has enforced conscription. He continues to prepare and sporadically fights a war with Ethiopia. Was that really worth all that effort to get back to where they started? What Collier has established is that where countries have a low level of income, slow growth, or even stagnation and negative growth, they are far more likely to fall into civil war. In fact, a typical low-income country such as Chad, Niger, Sierra Leone, Sudan faces a 1 in 7 chance of civil war in any 5-year period. A 1% drop in income increases that chance by 1%. So something as seemingly innocent as a decline of rainfall, which can have a serious impact on national income, increases the risk of war. And we see that now so much in Africa today, where climate change has had such a devastating impact on the prosperity and wealth of people. And if low income equals poverty, low growth equals hopelessness. And it is in this sense of hopelessness that fuels so many civil wars. For young men with no future, for them the risk of death is seen as worthwhile if it might bring wealth compared to the certainty of a life of poverty. And the wealth in question is this other side of this conflict trap, the natural resources of Africa, about which I'm speaking largely today. Africa has been described as a wealthy continent peopled by poor people. Globally, millions of people enjoy the wealth of Africa, including ourselves, but rarely the people of Africa themselves. Multinational corporations have fueled wars on that continent in order to have access to natural resources. Laurent Kabila, who led the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, is reported to have said that to fight a war in Africa, you need just two things: $10,000 and a satellite phone. $10,000 to pay your troops, and a satellite phone to do the deals with the multinational corporations to sell off the assets of the country, to fuel that war and to fill our pockets. It may have been somewhat hyperbolic to say this, but it does have the ring of truth about it. And there are other very devastating aspects to this question of civil war. Civil wars last 10 times longer on average than international wars. 5 years against 6 months. And the lower the income of the country involved, the longer the war. And the costs of these wars go way beyond the time of fighting, estimated to be even the length of the war again. And most worryingly, half of countries who've experienced civil war will revert to civil war within a period of 10 years. And civil wars not only affect the country in question. Even this morning, Mr. Gallagher referred to the impact of the violence in Northern Ireland on the economy of the border counties. We see throughout Africa how civil wars spill over into neighbouring countries, causing economic chaos, the impact of the arrival of refugees, the spread of disease such as malaria, HIV/AIDS, and so on. Civil war is therefore development in reverse, with national and regional incomes declining by up to 2.5% per year as a result. The starkest example of this is the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has had prolonged civil wars throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, and which has now reached a stage where, in order to establish the level of prosperity it enjoyed in 1960, will now have to wait to the year 2050. So it might be exciting to send in the troops, arriving like the cavalry over the hill, and the mediators to negotiate the peace and to promote reconciliation. And important as all of this is, only a sustainable solution to peacemaking will be to tackle the root cause. And low income, or low or negative income, is essentially the cause that must be addressed. I'd like to quote from Professor Collier on the conclusion of his study on the conflict trap. He said, if civil wars could be avoided by good governance and democratic rights, then peace would be an internal matter for the citizens of those countries. However, evidence is against such internal solutions. Democratic rights do not reduce the risk of war. When economic growth fails in a low-income country, the risks of war are hard to contain. Breaking the conflict trap is not something these countries can accomplish themselves. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is the challenge for Ireland. Because it seems to me that Ireland can play to its strengths in addressing this issue. It's just that we need to do it better and in a more rigorous way than we have done it heretofore. Our aid programme is poverty-focused and operates largely in low-income countries in Africa. Indeed, the relative stability of two of those countries, Ethiopia and Mozambique, is an excellent example of what I have been talking about. Both experienced lengthy and vicious civil wars in the 80s and the 90s. Both have been the beneficiaries of significant aid programs from a multitude of major donors, even receiving direct budget support, which is a form of aid which really is investing in government and government policies. And both of these countries have seen significant growth rates, up to 9% in the case of Mozambique. These are off a very low base, of course, but the movement is in the right direction. I believe now that Ireland must not only consolidate its aid programme, but reaffirm its commitments made so often in international fora to the developing world. That relationship should be based on justice and peace, and should be the hallmark of the new republic which we hope to build following this crisis. I believe that we can turn the economic crisis to be a real opportunity to reshape our country and to call forth the innate values we have as a nation, those of a sense of fairness, of generosity of spirit, and openness and solidarity with the developing world. Solidarity, ladies and gentlemen, is a very powerful word. Pope John Paul II defined it as this: not just a vague feeling of compassion or shallow distress, but a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. People talk about compassion fatigue, and they've been mentioning this phrase for years. In my role as the director of Trócaire, I simply don't see it. Last year, Trócaire's public income was the second highest since we were founded almost 40 years ago, only outmatched by the year of the Asian tsunami. 35 million euro was donated to Trócaire last year by the ordinary people of Ireland. This in a year when they were faced with the recession, uncertainty, the fear of the future. And not only have the people done it once, but they've done it again this year, with over 9 million euro already donated to Trócaire, not to mention the other millions to agencies like Concern and Goal and Oxfam for the people of the Horn of Africa. The people have shown the way in this regard. And governments have followed, often reluctantly. Our new government is promising a review of the Constitution, many aspects of which do require updating. I would specifically refer them to Article 29 of the Constitution, which deals with international relations. This article, written 75 years ago, reflects little of Ireland's extraordinary relationship with the developing world. Its opening section reads as follows: Ireland affirms its devotion to the ideal of peace and friendly cooperation amongst nations founded on justice and morality. 'Tis a fine statement, but it hardly describes the depth of the relationship which has been developed over decades between Ireland and the countries of the developing world. And I would propose that in any redrafting of the Constitution, that this article in particular should be given particular attention. It should reflect how Ireland has, over that period of time, through its missionaries, its aid organisations, and its aid programme, developed very close relationships with key countries and the communities therein. One rarely goes anywhere in Africa and meets someone in authority who will not say, I was educated by the Irish nuns, or I was educated by the Irish priests, or I was given my first chance, and so on and so forth. There are very few countries who have touched the people of the developing world the way Irish people have. And we do make the distinctions between our colonial past and that of our former colonial powers in the European Union. It is a reality. And it is a very precious thing that I believe we need to enshrine in the Constitution in terms of how we will conduct our external relations. We should speak of solidarity, of our firm and persevering determination to work for global justice. And I believe that setting such a high-level objective enshrined in our Constitution would establish a framework in which we can place our aid programme and our commitment to global peace. Our policies would have to be measured against such a declaration. Economic policy, trade policy, agricultural policy, proofed against global poverty. Are these policies acting to establish the common good, or simply some form of self-interest promoting our own interests over those of those who are less fortunate than ourselves? Our participation in policy discussions at the European Union would be critical in this regard, and we would bring that clarity of vision and of morality to those discussions. It's in that context of a constitutional clause that we could legislate for the aid programme, the international commitment we've entered into of reaching the target of 0.7% of GNP as overseas development aid, and maintaining it and even increasing it into the future. So this is not just something that goes backwards and forwards on the whim of policy or the daily ups and downs of the country. I believe that in following such a rigorous commitment, Ireland, despite our small size and our problems, can provide powerful leadership on a global level, as a country that, despite all its difficulties, meets its commitments to the world's poor. And I believe the Irish people would welcome this, such a commitment, as a defining characteristic of the new Ireland which we hope to build out of our current crisis. I've recently read a book by the Franciscan preacher Richard Rohr entitled Falling Upward. It is a book for personal reflection. It talks about the second half of life, not in a chronological sense, but often what happens to a person after a major setback. If we approach life with new insights, prepared to let go of old values and assume new, more liberating ones, then we have a chance to rebuild our life in a new and enlightened way. Ireland has had a great fall, a humiliation, being described even as one of the pigs. What an unfortunate acronym. We have suffered structural adjustment, something we used to feel sorry for poor countries in Africa and Central America and Latin America in the 90s, when the IMF and the World Bank subjected them to structural adjustment. Now we know what it feels like. We as a nation can continue to fall, but upwards, freed from the hubris and greed that brought on by affluence, brought back to earth, and ready to rise again on the values of solidarity, justice, and peace. Thank you.